Good afternoon and welcome to the Metro Tree Advisory Committee Tree Talk. Thank you so much for taking time out of your day on Tuesday morning, Tuesday noon, to join us and learn more about trees. We'll be starting shortly. For those of you who just joined us, we want to welcome you to Tree Talk, where we will talk about all types of different tree issues today. Thank you so much for joining us, and we'll be starting here momentarily. I want to welcome those who just joined us. We still have people who are joining. I hope that you are having your lunch, maybe eating a sandwich, and joining us to talk about trees. We really appreciate you taking time to do this and appreciate your support of Nashville's trees. We'll be starting here in just a few seconds. All right, I think we're going to go ahead and start. My name is Sharon Smith. I'm Assistant Director of Public Works, and I want to welcome everyone here that is joining us on our Tree Talk. Yes, we're going to be talking about trees and everything that you've ever wanted to know. If you have questions during today's webinar, look down at the bottom of your screen. You're going to see a little Q&A. And I want to encourage people, if you have questions for the experts, feel free to type them in. And they will be answered either typed in back to you or live. I see we already have a question. I'm going to look at it to see what it is before we go forward because this is very exciting. Excellent. Thank you, Christine. Hoping to do a program about trees at the library. I think that is a great idea. All right, at this point, I'm going to introduce the Metro Public Works Tree Lady. Jennifer Smith is the Public Works horticulturalist, is extremely knowledgeable about trees, loves trees, and has taught me almost everything I know about trees. Jennifer, you're on.
Thank you, Sharon. I also want to introduce our guest, Michael Davey. Michael's a board-certified master arborist, and he's an active member of the Metro Tree Advisory Committee. Welcome, Michael, and thank you.
Thanks, good to be here.
A little bit about the Metro Tree Advisory Committee. The group is celebrating its 36th year here in Nashville, and its mission is to promote tree planting and preservation throughout the city. And I have to say, they're a great group of tree advocates working on behalf of our city trees. I love going to the meetings. It's my honor through my work to coordinate their activities. And when I go, they already get who I am because they already know I'm a tree person and they're a tree people as well. So it's a very friendly environment. But we do a lot of outreach and education throughout the year. Normally we're at, not this year, but normally we're at like the the Earth Festival, the Lawn and Garden Show, and other events where we have education and outreach. But again, they work throughout the year, and during this time when we're not able to meet, we wanted to do our outreach through this Tree Talk, where we can reach out to the community and let them know about some tree issues. One of the first things that I like to know about people is what is their favorite tree. And so today, I am going to let you know what my favorite tree is, and then Michael's going to talk about his favorite tree. Do y'all see that? Move forward. There you go.
Hey.
It's the bald cypress. Now, why I like the bald cypress, it's so stately to me. It just has a presence about itself. You may think it's very coarse, but if you were actually to pet the tree, actually it's very soft and gives you a nice sense about it. Look at the beautiful fall color. It's actually a deciduous tree. It's a deciduous conifer, which is unusual. So it loses its needles before the winter. And you can see a picture at the top of the green leaves. But I think that it provides a lot of interest. It gets very tall, and some of the prettiest sights I've seen is a whole row of them in the fall. It just has that stunning, breathtaking color. And then when the needles drop, it actually has a nice structure to it as well. But another thing that it has is the roots come up. It has those noses, as they call it, and we think that's because the needs more oxygen to the root system, and they like they're actually a good street tree if it's the appropriate place to put it. Of course, you can't have overhead utility lines, but it's swampy area. It's the state tree of Louisiana, and I've just said probably for 30 years it's my favorite tree. If we do more tree talks, I'm sure I'll come up with other favorite trees. A little known fact about me is my parents named me Jennifer Pine. So maybe next time I'll think of a pine that will be my new favorite tree. But again, at maturity, it can be 50 to 70 feet. And it's just, I think, a stunner. It's a spectacular tree.
Well, their maturity can be really, really old too.
That's a good point. Okay, Michael, we're going to move on to Michael's favorite tree. And I have a confession. I had to force him to pick a favorite tree.
Well, yeah. So I don't really have a favorite tree because I can't play favorites with. It's like children or something like that. You know, you can't really play favorites with your children. But I do love bur oaks. They're native to Nashville. I actually have a huge range. They go from really Canada down to Texas. And like if you see them in the hill country around Austin, Texas, I guess where my wife's from, and you'll see them down there. They're kind of small and gnarly, kind of like the upper right picture. But around here, they get to be gigantic. We're actually kind of at a little bit at the eastern edge of their range. They kind of go into the Midwest and they go up in the upper Midwest. But I'd specifically mentioned to Jennifer this. There was, when I was a kid, there used to be one that was over on the golf course nearby, and it was one of those that had a plaque. Like in 1976, the International Society of Arboriculture, which is like our kind of industry group, they did a project where they went around and kind of identified trees around the country that were around during the bicentennial. And so there was one of those over at the golf course, and it was like a big, huge bur oak. It was like 8 feet in diameter. They're just great. They're awesome. They're really drought tolerant. They live a long time. They're strong. The only annoying thing is that their acorns are gigantic, and so, you know, but they're great trees.
I think that the winter look to it is spectacular. That gnarly look, I think it provides a lot of winter interest.
Yeah, they're just awesome trees. But I mean, I also love chinkapin oaks and, you know, Shumard oaks. Those are the other Nashville native oaks.
This is a white oak?
It's in the white oak family.
Yes, and I particularly like the white oaks. And there was a noted bur oak there in Centennial Park for a long time. It's not there, but it was right up against the road. And I know a lot of for some reason, I know a lot of guys whose bur oak, you know, that's their thing. You can spell it with one R or two, both are acceptable. But yeah, I think that's fun when there's a group of people that really, you know, this speaks to them. And I'm sure everyone listening probably has a tree, maybe from their childhood that they remembered, or maybe it was at their grandparents' house that they remember. And you talked about, Michael, the chinkapin oak, and I have a friend who has been in the beautification business forever, and her favorite tree is chinkapin, and I cannot ever think of her without thinking of that tree. So you all will probably always remember me, the tree lady with the bald cypress, and Michael was the bur oak man. That's what we'll be known for forevermore. But so just moving on, there are a lot of things going on in our out there, and Michael is out every day working on issues and talking to landowners that have trees that are concerned. And we just want to talk a little bit about what he's seeing out there. And I think one of the fascinating things is what he's seeing has a lot to do with our weather patterns this past year. And want to just talk a little bit about that, Michael.
Yeah, well, it's the past number of years, really, but definitely there's a lot of acute things that have happened in the last number of months since the end of the summer of last year. So if you guys remember, it was August and September where it virtually didn't rain at all. It was well into the 90s for really both those months, and it was into the 90s into early October. I think, wasn't it almost, it was like 98 degrees in early October? It was like, record for the day.
Very unusual, yes.
Yeah, and super, super dry. And so, a lot of the native trees around here are adapted to, they can handle the heat, they can handle, periodic droughts. But for anything that's stressful, and for trees that are kind of in an urban environment, which is, it's not like the woods. You got to think about the way the soils are, what trees are generally meant to grow in. And they grow in these, mostly in forest soils where they have a lot of organic material that builds up, or even in some places around here, there were grasslands and prairies, but they still had less disturbed, deeper profiles of soil like this. Soils have these, it has to have kind of texture and openness, it has to have drainage, roots require oxygen. So soils get compacted in the urban soils. And so that just exacerbates those drought conditions that are going to happen anyway. And they seem to be getting, worse lately, all the weather extremes overall. So it was 98 degrees in early October. And then in early November
Yes.
was the first really, it was like the coldest day of all winter. It was in early November, a few weeks after it had been 98 degrees. And so,
New patterns here.
pardon?
New patterns here of weather that we're having.
It's quite the extreme. And so a lot of stuff really suffered from that. And so if many of you are familiar with crepe myrtles, and you've been going around this year and you've seen a lot of crepe myrtles with extensive dieback on the top, it's mostly due to that first freeze after being very hot and dry. The trees just didn't have enough time to really harden off. They kind of have to go through they kind of have to kind of ramp down to get ready for winter, and they just didn't have enough time. So, and then after that, there was a lot of rain. It was super, super dry, hot, and then it just slammed shut. And then it got very wet through the winter and into the spring. And so, what I have seen, and the other arborists here have seen a lot of this year, it's a common thing, but it's really prevalent this year, is a disease called Phytophthora. And
It's the root rot.
it is. It's a root disease. It's not a fungus, and it's not it's weird. It's actually more closely related to animals than to fungi, but it's a root pathogen. And so it's like, it has to have a lot of water in the soil for it to build up. It's something that's kind of it's native to the soils almost everywhere, but it has to have the right conditions to build up. And so stressed out plants and a lot of water equals Phytophthora. And so what it does is they have these they almost look like little eggs. And because there's a lot of water in the soil, those things hatch out and they have spores that swim in the soil. It's freaky. They're like swimming in through the dirt, and they start to kill roots. And so what happens is, even though there's a lot of water in the soil, they start to have a lot of root death. And so all those roots that would have been supplying water and nutrients to the crown, they're just not there anymore. And so the crowns start to decline. And so it's a lot of times it's just either maybe patchy or an overall kind of decline in plants. And so seen a lot of it this year. And it gets worse. You notice it worse as it gets hotter.
Hey, Michael, just a general question then. Since the roots are underground, how do you determine if it has this root rot? What are your keys? What are you looking for?
Yeah, so I mean, there's a lot of clues that, you see it enough. What we do to determine for sure is we send in a sample to the lab, and they do it's an ELISA assay test that they basically can get the genetic markers. It's like, this is definitely Phytophthora. They extract it you get a root sample. And so we do a lot of sampling just to kind of verify, but after a while you do, a few hundred samples, and you kind of get to know, yeah, that's probably Phytophthora. And so and I've gotten better at kind of detecting it early, because it's like a lot of stuff that, the earlier you can kind of detect it, the more likely you are to be able to successfully treat it or do something about it. You can, a lot of places where there's that's the downside of irrigation. We see a lot of it in irrigated landscapes, and just because often people have their irrigation set too high, too frequent. And if it's on top of a lot of rain, like we've had earlier this year, it's just kind of a recipe for Phytophthora.
Well, with all the winds and the pop-up winds, it is a disaster waiting to happen. You remember the tree that I lost at my house that had the root rot, and the leaves had just come out, full leaves, and wind had come from a new direction from the north. And my house never comes from the north, and it just took, it's called a full cell. All the leaves are on it, and it just took it down. So you do have to be aware of issues like that, and keeping your neighbors and you're safe, and keeping your tree sustainable. So what can you do about it?
I'll say, like, so Phytophthora is different than some of the other root rots, or they call them butt rots, which is basically like the lower part of the trunk, where it kind of transitions, the tissue transitions from the above ground portion where it's kind of leaves and twigs and wood, and it goes into the roots, which have just kind of different physiological structure because they're always underground. They don't need leaves down there, they need roots. And so there's in that transitional point, that's kind of an entry for a lot of other certain kinds of decay fungi or some of them are pathogens. That is, they actually will actively, kill tissues. Usually they get in through a weakness. Most of the times they start with another injury, but those are the ones that do more to impact the how well a tree is anchored. So the Phytophthora, that really mostly kills those little fine, like if you dig in the soil and you see there's a root and there's all these little fine fibrous things, those are the root hairs. And those really are what do most of the work in the soil. Like those things that just adhere to soil particles, and they get all the moisture and they get all of the minerals in solution, and they bring it up to the crown. Those bigger woody roots are just the pipelines. And up closer to the trunk, they're part of the anchorage of the tree. So the Phytophthora doesn't usually disrupt the anchorage as much because it's kind of killing those finer roots. After a while, it can set off other things. But some of the other root rots are, those are the ones that are kind of worrisome at the base of a tree. If you see mushrooms growing against the base of a tree, some of those are, scarier. So, I mean, you were asking how to detect it. Like Phytophthora, most of the time the biggest thing is upper and outer parts of the crown. It can even be in bushes. They like any woody plant really can get it. But you'll see upper and outer parts that look off color. They can be chlorotic, which means they're kind of yellowy, but sometimes they have like a reddish tint to them, or you'll see the tips of branches dying off. And when you have tip dieback, when you have like the very ends of branches which are dying, there's only a few things that'll do that, but most often it's from something happening underground with the roots, because if there's not those roots that are to be able to get moisture and bring it up, there's just not as many roots to supply the crown, then they get water up as far as they can, and then the upper and outer parts where it's farther for them to transport water, they just don't have it, so they just give up on the outer part. So you see discoloration in the tips, thin, weak-looking tips on branches. That's the biggest sign for like Phytophthora.
And what do you recommend for treatment?
You really kind of have to get it. I'd tell you the most important thing is if it's irrigated, turn down the irrigation. It's important that things have adequate water. It's kind of like Goldilocks. It's like you can't keep the soil really saturated. If it happens a lot with newly planted trees, actually, because people are told you got to water the trees, water the trees. Newly planted trees are stressed out, and if they have different soil types than the put into the compacted yard soil, and it's kind of like this nice loose root ball, you have bad drainage sometimes, and so if people overwater it, that can cause Phytophthora. But so it's mostly like, if as much as you can control water. It's important that they have water available, that there's just moisture in the soil, but that's the simplest thing. And beyond that, there are treatments you have to get an arborist to do, really.
Like injections, soil drenches?
It's mostly soil drenches. There's different things to put in the soil. So, and because what you can do is you can arrest that. you can you stop it from killing the roots, and then it's all up at that point to the tree and how much energy they have to be able to kind of regrow roots. So they can ebb and flow in the natural environment. Like Phytophthora can kind of come and die down some if it gets to be a large dry spell, but it's, you know, they're going to be that stressed after that and more predisposed when it gets wet again.
It's hard to see our iconic trees in Nashville suffer. Like someone asked me the other day, well, what does iconic tree mean? And to me, it's just one that's been in a neighborhood, it's noted, it's a landmark in a neighborhood, and we're just losing them. And I get calls quite a bit about these trees, and you know, trees have a lifespan, and so many of our neighborhoods are 75 to 100 years old, and those trees are in that age, and they're simply just dying of old age as well, which they will do. Another area that I've been getting calls about are conifers, and I think that the weather has played into the decline of some of the conifers.
Yeah, like it's really complicated. It's you know, sometimes it's hard. Like I go all over the place, and I'm looking at trees and all different kinds of properties and stuff, and then you see some of these same patterns, and so like but sometimes you have to do some kind of detective work to figure out what's going on. And so for a lot of arborvitaes that had damage last year, some of them were a lot of them that we ended up testing had like some Phytophthora, but then afterward, when it was really, really hot, and they were in irrigated landscapes. So there's irrigation, so they have enough water in the soil, but when it got really hot and there was no soil and no water in the air for a couple months, they started to brown on the very tips. And that happened because they didn't have quite enough roots. And even though they had irrigation in the soil, the ends of the foliage started to brown out because they just didn't have enough to supply when it got really, really hot for months. And we saw with the freeze damage again, I think a lot of species, like it seems like Hinoki cypress and cryptomerias had a lot of just individual branches or parts of the crowns die out because of sometimes it was just simply freeze damage, but in some instances the freeze opened them up to cankers. Like there's a common canker called Botrisphaeria, and a lot of them had Botrisphaeria, you know, but any canker, they have to have some kind of an opening. The trees have to be weakened. There has to be something to kind of open them up. There's not very many that are just aggressive and just kill stuff. That's something that's kind of hard for people to understand. There's not a lot of things, like besides something like EAB that's not really native.
That's the emerald ash borer. We'll get to talk about that a little bit.
But there's a lot of the problems that happen with trees and plants. They're precipitated by some kind of environmental external factor, and so it's either it can be weather, or it can be the stuff that people do, like, oh, we had to dig a new water line here by the house, and we cut the roots off of half of this oak tree, and so you know, and then
that would be trenching through the root system.
That's right. And we can talk about root systems later, but that's a big common thing. Like there's so much activity happens in people's yards, around their trees, in the soil, that have these ramifications. It sometimes takes years for those things to accumulate. And so it's really hard. Sometimes this maybe the rain over the winter is the thing that polishes them off after all these other insults for years previous, you know. I was gonna say, someone said, how can the general public test for Phytophthora? I'm pretty sure that UT can do that. You'd have to get a decent root sample. Like basically you'll kind of dig in the soil and collect some of the roots. Oh, somebody says they'd like to answer the question. I don't know. But you have to send in a root sample usually to be able to get a positive result.
When you water your tree, you don't want it to be soggy. Don't ever let it get soggy. And that's what you're talking about here. That's when you get into secondary issues. You want to make sure that you water it deeply to the depth of the root ball, but that it has to drain.
Yeah, and for new trees, it's more important to get water in outside of that root ball, really, because what you're trying to do is get that tree to establish the roots into this new soil that's surrounding it. And so you want to make sure that that outside of the root ball is what's conducive for root growth. And a lot of times it's not, because it's, it's beaten down and compacted. And when you're shoveling it, you're like, man, this is really hard to dig in. You got to think about roots later. These little the little things that you have to poke through the soil to get into that. And so,
but it has to do it so it can be sustainable. I know when we talk about, if we get to it, talking about tree planting, when you're planting a tree in a new environment, you don't want to make it so easy for it around it, so you don't add compost or fertilizer, of course, there, because that creates what we call a bathtub effect. And those roots are so happy they're never going to grow out into its new environment, new home. So that's important to note too.
Yeah, that's what happens a lot with just the soil ball of if you get something that's balled and burlapped, or especially if it's in a container and it's just in potting soil. It's like, if you don't do the work to get those roots kind of going into the new soil, the roots are going to go like, you know what, I'm happy in here. And they just kind of start to circle around in there.
Circle around, and then they get shallow and they circle the root. Yeah, it leads to oftentimes a slow death.
Super common. Yeah. And a lot of times it's like, or sometimes they'll kind of get through the first few years, they'll establish and they'll be like, oh, they're doing great. And then it's like 15 years in, that's where the impacts of those bad roots kind of start to knock them off.
So I get calls too about what's wrong with my tree. And I had a call a year or two ago about someone's maple tree that defoliated in the summer. And I went through every scenario of thinking, what could it be? What could it be? And finally I just said, well, he kept saying, no. Finally I said, well, unless someone, poisoned the ground. And he was quiet, and he goes, I had a new fence put up, and I told the contractor they could wash out their equipment and stuff down near that tree. Mm-hmm. And it changed the pH. It just did a lot of things. It just burned the leaves off. So you have to be really cognizant of things like that, not unintended consequences, if you will. Well, any other type of questions or issues you're seeing out there, Michael?
Oh Lord, yes, but let me see. We can talk about construction damage, which is just a common thing, just all kinds of issues that are
well, construction damage, with the amount of development we're having right now in Nashville, is big, and it is impacting the sustainability of our urban forest. And when if you're going to choose to save a tree, you've got to make sure you save that root zone and be tenacious about it.
Yeah, even if you're doing a little project where you have to do an improvement, or we have to fix the drainage here. It's like, anytime you're digging in the soil, you're doing something in the soil, you're potentially damaging roots. If you add soil on top of roots, that can be detrimental.
The roots breathe.
Yeah, they have to have oxygen. They have to have,
and if you like drive on the root system, it compresses the soil, and it takes out all those little air pockets, and it doesn't pop up like a sponge does. It stays like a brick, and you can see decline in a tree. It may take several years, and that's the trick when a developer doesn't protect that root zone area, which actually is a little bit further than the drip line of the tree. Then the owner buys that property, and within a few years, that tree, that iconic tree that everyone wanted to save, is slowly dying at that point. And it's hard to recover unless you do some air spading. And there's things that Michael, I'm sure you do in your practice to help those roots not be so compacted.
Yeah, it's a lot of work, but there's definitely stuff that arborists can do to kind of help improve the soil. But the simple thing is that people can do that it's slow, but it does work over time, is if you mulch areas, and the larger an area, the better. Mulch is super helpful over time, but not damaging stuff in the first place is really that's the best thing you can do. So let me see. Somebody had a question here real quick about
they talk about watering in the strips or just leave them alone. So in those green strips, this person referred to them as hell strips, but in the green strips, I haven't heard that before. Um,
Appropriate.
there's, yeah, so they have access, even if there's a sidewalk. Under the sidewalk, there's other areas where the water can drain, but you still want to be cognizant that the, like on the roadside too, that soil and gravel is really compressed for standards for roads. So you want to be aware of not overwatering those. That's a good question.
If they're newly planted, though, you know, definitely
Yes.
they need to at least have adequate moisture in the soil.
So when we plant a tree, what the little talk is that you're not going to get much action the first year. The tree's been transplanted. It's trying to get a grip on its new location. So we call it sleeping. And then in year 2, if it's well watered deeply, in other words, make sure it gets to the bottom of the root ball. Then at that time, the roots are kind of, okay, I'm gonna go out and my new environment. So it sleeps and then creeps. And then by year 3, the roots should be somewhat established out in the new place. And so it has enough roots to support the growth up. So you may say, well, why isn't my tree growing? Well, it has to have the roots to support it. And by year 3, that's typically you want to water for up to 3 years. And then later, you know, in the growing season or in times of drought, that's why those first 3 years are critical. And then once you have your roots growing and established, that's when you come back and you do the correctional pruning. So if you have 2 leaders, perhaps you'll cut one off or cut part of it off. If you have a branch that should be growing this way but circles around, that should be cut off, or branches that rub against each other. That's the correctional pruning.
There's
And
a website that's the ISA has a website. It's treesaregood.org. It's trees are good, all one word. And that does have a lot of information on, you know, pruning on trees. It also has stuff on planting and mulching.
and that's the ISA is the International Society of Arboriculture, and that's the certification that Michael has. But the goal is that the tree that's well pruned in that first few years, again after the roots have established, then that tree will be more sustainable because it won't have those close branches of those crotches where when the wind comes it can blow them together and cause weaknesses, and they should be more sustainable over time, which is our goal.
Yeah, and if you do when they're a little tree, it's like a little tiny cut with some pair of pruners, as opposed to when they get to be a big tree and it's, you know, the same branches, that big 10-inch cut. You can't do it at that point.
So Michael, I think one of the things one of the many things I love about trees, and just following up with what you said, is how it can compartmentalize and how it you know, it can't get up and walk to the doctor. It has to be able to take care of itself. And so when you do get a cut, when the tree cut gets small or big, how it, you want to talk a little bit about that, how it seals itself?
Yeah, sure. So this is relevant too, because I was thinking about talking about hackberries.
Nashville's favorite subject, hackberries.
Yeah, hackberries.
And I will say, everyone out there, if we didn't have our hackberries, we would have a lot less tree canopy in Nashville.
Hackberry is by far the most common tree in the Nashville basin, especially in any kind of urban, suburban areas. If you get out in the woods, it's less common, but any disturbed areas, it's everywhere. So you're talking about compartmentalization. So the way trees grow is basically, you know, every year here's a branch, there's a trunk of a small tree. Every year they put a layer on the outside, kind of like an onion. They just put a layer on, and they elongate on the ends. And so the end of it will go out, and as it does that, it kind of puts a layer on the outside. So it's like, if you stylized it, it could be like cones stacking on each other. So if they get an injury, so as they grow, when it gets to be a bigger tree, they only have some number of years of the outside rings, which are live tissue and still actively working. And it depends on the species as to how many years, but as they grow, the inside of them, they kind of shut that down. And as they shut it down, They put in varying amounts of defensive chemicals just to kind of protect them from decay. Hackberries don't do that very much at all. But say Osage orange is another common tree around Nashville. Those, you can have a dead branch on that for 20 years and it's still hard as a rock. On a hackberry in 2 years, it's a piece of sponge. So anyway, they put on these layers on the outside. If you prune off a limb, so it exposes that, that outer bark is like a skin, it's protective, and it keeps anything from getting in there. And again, the active tissue, they also usually have defensive chemicals. That's what keeps bugs and stuff from just constantly going into them. Again, when they get stressed, that's the time when they're weakened and stuff gets into them. But so as they grow, if you cut a branch off, then it exposes that inner wood. It's kind of, some of it's dead, some of it's alive on the outside. But so where it opens it up, it kind of dries out and the tissue will die back some, but where it's still alive at the margins, the tree goes, well, I gotta cover this up. And so it starts growing tissue back at the edges. And so like a lot of times if you see an older cut, as almost looks like a donut on around the outside of say an old branch cut, that is it's callus tissue or wound wood. And as the tree grows, it puts more and more layers and tries to close back around that. So again,
I've had a text from our chair of our tree advisory committee just making a point for the hackberries that they are good for birds.
They have a number of wonderful attributes. I love them. I think they're beautiful. Like in the winter, like the winter silhouette of a lot of hackberries and sugarberries, they're beautiful. And they can be really good trees. They can have very good structure. The problem is their biggest problem really is that they don't have very much decay resistance, And it's interesting too, because like Nashville or Middle Tennessee is like the nexus of like hackberries as a genus, where the southern hackberry, which is sugarberry, their northern extent is just probably around like the Tennessee-Kentucky border, I think. And then there's the northern hackberry, which is just hackberry. They go down into like maybe northern Alabama, but they cross over in Middle Tennessee. It's like a Venn diagram. And in Middle Tennessee, they're both here. They hybridize also. And there's just a huge genetic diversity. And so I've seen some just really cool, fantastic, beautiful ones, strong. And I've seen some real pieces of junk, but I love them. They're still a good tree.
So we've had a question from actually one of our beautification commissioners. And for those who don't know, every city council district across Davidson County has a beautification commissioner that works on litter and tree issues and other things. So her question is, how do we really know when it's time to take down a hackberry?
How do we really know when it's time to take it? I think you have to get, you can have an arborist look at it to judge how safe relatively it is, just to see how much of a risk it poses. And after that, it's the owner's choice. Like, what level of risk are you willing to live with, or how much do you love this tree? You can. Well,
and also, does it have a target? If it fell, would it hit anything? Or
that's the risk assessment that you have an arborist come out and do. They can, but even when you do that, if if I do a risk assessment, I can say it's not very likely, but that still doesn't mean that it couldn't happen, or that it's very likely, and that still doesn't mean that it would happen. But
right.
But anyway, you have to, I try to give people the information to make the decisions as much as I can. We should answer some of these questions. I guess I'll go back up to.
That was one of the questions. I like Cynthia. Cynthia wrote in, and she's on the tree advisory committee, that her favorite tree is probably the pawpaw. And with that, you need to make sure you have at least 2 trees so you get your fruit.
They're delicious.
A lot more. I think there's a guy from our high school class that's written in.
So somebody has a small red bud, 6 feet tall, 1 inch diameter. The leaves are damaged in the late freeze. Now the leaves on the top branches are brown, and there are many water sprouts coming from the bottom. Can you save the tree by selecting one? If they're coming from the roots, that's a sucker technically, and you can grow a new tree from a sucker. If the actual top is literally dead, where the leaves are brown, yeah, you can choose a new terminal if it's vigorous.
Yes.
Yeah,
I,
it's
I've
tough.
seen them where they've almost created a grove by letting all the suckers come back up
Yeah.
off the interstate. I've seen that. Will
Somebody has,
crates recover from last year's damage, and do you recommend cutting them back to encourage new growth or leaving them alone?
yeah. So they will recover just because they're kind of like Bradford pears and they're nearly impossible to kill. That was purely physical damage from the freeze, and so like especially the Natchez crepe myrtles got just hammered. But it's weird, in some places they still look fine.
Well, the
Uh,
Natchez is really one of the hardier ones, so that tells
it,
you something there.
it was weird. That was just a bizarre weather event, the way it occurred. So yeah, they will come back. Cutting them back doesn't necessarily encourage the new growth. They're all putting out their growth on those ends. A lot of them will just have a strip of tissue, like maybe one half of it that goes up, and they'll be sprouting up off of that backside. And you don't really see it until later on, again, as it grows that new tissue to try and close back around it. And you'll see like, oh, this half of this is dead. It doesn't matter so much. The dead up there doesn't hurt them. And they're basically going to kind of make these decisions on their own about where they have the energy to put out new growth. You may want to prune them just to kind of even up the form, because a lot of them are super irregular. Some of them just probably need to be cut back to the ground, and you can allow the suckers from the roots to come up and turn into new trees.
We have a few more questions here I want to get to. Can I prune my American plum now, where it has small limbs that cross over each other?
Yeah, I mean it's if you have to do heavier pruning, then I think it's better to wait till the winter. If you're just doing a few small limbs, it's fine to do it now. Especially just again, go to Trees Are Good so you can see how to do a proper pruning cut.
And then we had a question about should Nashvillians look at planting new types of trees, that's new almost in quotes, that are more climate resistant? And we have the ornamental ones that are from Asia, and then we have a lot of course our native trees and shrubs that have done well over time here.
Yeah, a lot of the natives have a really broader north to south range. Like if you look at hop hornbeam, they go from Nova Scotia to Honduras, and so
Wow.
you can probably plant those and they'll do okay. Bur oaks, again, like I said, they have a big range. There's a lot of stuff that has broader ranges. It's hard to say about like the way the climate is changing, because there's kind of more of these extremes. You could potentially say plant a live oak. I've heard people talk about planting live oaks here, and I think they can grow well for a while, but you could still get these extreme freezes in the winter, which could maybe potentially damage those more than it could.
It just takes one weather event to change it.
Yeah.
Everyone probably remembers the freeze of Easter. Was that 3, 4, 5 years ago? That just killed off so many things, tops of trees.
I think it was 10 years ago. Woo, time flies.
Oh my. Let's see. Any other thoughts? This is what about the woolly aphids that are a nightmare? My neighbor's trees are infected and they refuse to treat.
So yeah, the woolly aphids, those are another non-native insect, and they've only been around, I think, 10 years or so, something like that, 10, 15 years. They go after hackberries only. And so everybody talks about the sap on hackberries, but it's really aphid poop. They're sucking on the leaves, they're sucking the sugars out of there, and they're pooping down sugar.
The adelgids.
Sticky all over. Those are aphids, yeah. So that's the sticky stuff, and then it grows a black city mold. So if your neighbors will not treat, the only thing you can do is release predatory midges or convergent lady beetles or things like that. So,
which will eat them.
Yes, there are predators. They're not as, for better or for worse, some of the chemical control methods are pretty effective. So if you can't do that, then, the lady beetles and the other predatory insects are your best bet, because you can let them off on your property and they'll go where the aphids are.
True. So we've had someone talk about how much they've enjoyed the program today and would be interested in learning more about the Tree Advisory Committee. And we just, in general, we meet once a month, and we do have our outreach where we go to help with different tree planting events across the city. We're at the Lawn and Garden Show, the Master Gardening Festival, the Earth Day Festival, and many others where we're just doing the outreach. And we're leading the educational effort, outreach effort on the emerald ash borer. Speaking of which, we will have a webinar tomorrow on the emerald ash borer. And that is, I should know because I'm giving it, but let me just double check, 6 o'clock. And you can register there, the same place you register for this talk. Just briefly talking about the emerald ash borer, this is a big deal. We estimate that there's about 1.6 million ash trees in Davidson County, and all native ash trees, unless they're treated, will die, and they become brittle and they could fall and hurt people or houses. And so this is something we really are trying to get the word out, and want you to be aware of it, and then spread the word to your neighbors and others about this issue. But to really get the full spectrum of it, do try to be there tomorrow night, or we'll be offering additional talks on it. But it's it's an epidemic.
It's a huge deal. It really is.
Huge.
In the next few years, it's a huge deal.
And Michael, you were saying that you're seeing the dieback just across the county now.
Yeah, I was over in yes, it's everywhere. Pretty much. I mean, it's weird too, because even where I was this morning, there was one tree which was like about a third dead, and then next to it was one which looked pretty good. And so it's very sporadic. There's a few areas, like I think I sent you some pictures from far southeast, whatever, almost towards Smyrna, and where they're all pretty much dead.
I've heard they're really significant there.
But there's
and one of the things that if you have an ash tree, you have to determine if you have one first. But this is the last best growing season to treat your ash trees.
Yeah, again, it's people will be lucky enough that they can, if they miss it, they can treat them next year and maybe even the next year. It all depends. I wouldn't gamble with it though. If you can treat them, them.
And after it's 25 or 30% dieback, the tree, doesn't really come back well.
Yeah,
so
even where it's dead, the larvae have gone farther down before it dies out. So.
And I personally had my trees treated this year, and one of the reasons why I made that decision was I wasn't ready to make my decision yet about my ash trees. So I bought myself 2 more years before I have to decide if I want to have those trees removed. 2 more years where I could save to have those trees removed. So these are if you have ash trees, or if your neighbor has an ash tree that could actually fall into your yard, you need to come up with your management decision on what you're going to do. And
it's like if nothing else, you have to get a plan together, because it's going to happen. It's inevitable. So you need to get ahead of it as much as you can.
Absolutely. So for this tree talk, we've had a good time talking about trees and tree issues, but just perhaps in the next talk we'll talk more just about the Nashville tree organizations that are out there working on behalf of our trees. Just to review them, the Tree Advisory Committee, again, that's hosting the program today. The Nashville Tree Foundation, you can see it was started in 1986. They really got involved with the tornado of, was it 98? The tornado of 98? And replanting East Nashville, and they have relief day every fall, and they do a lot of planting at schools and programs in schools. And we have our Root Nashville, which is our citywide campaign to plant 500,000 trees by 2050. So if you think of us in our county losing up to 1.6 million ash trees. The amount of growth and development we're losing trees to, and just simply the old age, and then the storms, not to mention tornadoes. We have a lot of things working against us in our canopy. So Root Nashville's out there. Their goal again is to plant 500,000 trees by 2050. And they have a place where you can go plot your tree. If you plant a tree in your backyard, front yard, all the trees that are being planted by the nonprofits are being put into that as well. So we've got to get our canopy, just so if we're losing so much, we need to be proactive in planting. And then the Nashville Tree Conservation Corps, they've really helped work on some tree legislation that's important, but also they have a tree cell, and it's a good way to get a tree planted in your yard. We know if we plant in metro property, we have less than 5% of the property. So we're not going to make the big percentage difference, but we got to get trees planted in your yard, in your neighbor's yard, and make sure they're maintained so they'll grow up and be sustainable. So the Tree Corps really makes it so easy for anybody to order a tree delivered to your yard. You can plant it yourself, or you can hire another feed to have those trees planted. I think it's a very affordable way to sustain our urban forest. So I recommend that as well. Michael, you're involved with about all these groups.
Well, I try. I mean, I'm a one-trick pony. It's trees. So
yeah, me too.
They're all great organizations. They're all doing their thing. It's great that there's so many organizations in Nashville that are working to promote trees. Working on ordinances to help protect trees. I think this is important stuff to happen.
Well, I'd like to make a plug for people who want to get involved. One place to kind of plug in is the Nashville Tree Foundation has the Green Shirt program. And so all these groups have done in a day events where they might try to plant 300 trees or so, and they get these volunteers that come in for a done in a day event, but they've never necessarily planted a tree before. And it's really important to get the tree planted correctly. Very important. So the Green Shirts are trained, they go through a training where they learn more about how to properly lead volunteers and the safety involved, and then how to properly plant a tree. And then these Green Shirts are assigned to different crews during those done in a day events. And so the quality of our planting is better, and the survivability of those trees grows way up. And I will say that all three organizations are really working hard to, and they have set up standards of how we are going into our fall planting season, can't miss the season. And so how volunteers can work safety issues with the COVID, and the issues that they're requiring the volunteers to follow to keep us all safe. It's really important, and they're doing a good.
Everybody's trying to think ahead about the plan for that. Yeah. So
very, very important. So they're all working on that. So anyway, I'll just see if there's any more questions. I could have lots of other things I could talk about, but let's see, we just have a few more.
So treatment for hackberry aphids. There's a few systemics. Again, those are neonicotinoids, which a lot of people have a lot of concern about. Those are about the only ones, other than there is a stem injection. I don't generally like stem injections, even though it's good because it's super localized, but in hackberries, you're making a lot of injuries every year. You have to treat them every year, and at the base where they're decay prone. But the neonicotinoids, it's very complicated. It's too much to get into now, but it's effective for the aphids. Other than that, there's just biological controls generally, like I was talking about before.
Just I have one thing and then one more comment here. The EAB treatment, that the injections, which is what is recommended now, not the soil drench or the bark drench spray, but the injections at this point, and those are good for 2 years, correct?
Yeah, that's right. So yeah, and if people want to find out, information on EAB, yeah, they can go to these talks that we're giving. There's also a website that's emerald-board.info. There's a lot of information on there about all the different
And
treatments.
we have on our trees.nashville.gov website information on the EAB, and we have our noted brochure with the big green bug. It's really not this big, of course. It's the emerald ash borer literally is about the size of a cooked grain piece of rice. But anyway, this has gotten a lot of attention, and you can download that from trees.nashville.gov. And we also have the Tennessee Environmental Council planting and caring for 1 million native trees statewide. So we're so blessed. The Tennessee Tree Day for 2021 is coming up March 20th next spring. So between all these efforts,
Good way to get a lot of trees in the ground too.
Yeah.
The small trees establish well very often. It's as long as they get kept away from weed eaters and get a little bit of water.
So someone wrote in, I have a gigantic ash tree that is right by my house. Is it inevitable that it will die despite treatment? Well, all trees have a natural life, however.
Yeah, that's true. But no, if it's treated correctly in general, the treatment, the injection treatment, it does work really, really well. The other kinds, they don't work as well. You
have to have a smaller tree. If you have a gigantic tree, you have to do the injections.
Yeah, in general, that's what works best. But it works very well in general. Other than the injuries from the drilling, they live a normal lifespan. So.
And you can only do those injections when the tree is actively taking up water and nutrients. So the growing season.
That's right. So somebody asked about the best way to protect young trees from deer or other animals. The only thing you can do is either spray repeatedly with some kind of stinky stuff, or you can put small fences around them.
Sleeves. The sleeves. It's the sleeves because the deer want to rub their antlers to.
Some of them eat them. Yeah, they eat them also. I've seen a lot of arborvitaes. They just love browsing off the lower foliage, and so you'd actually have to put some kind of fence around them. It's tough.
I've always thought you could plant Chinese holly around it and we'll keep everything away. Stuff is so dangerous. Okay, well, we're about out of time, but I just want to thank Michael, our guest today, and our first Tree Talk presented by the Nashville Tree Advisory Committee. And we hope to be back. Perhaps we haven't decided yet how often we want to do this, but we certainly have a wealth of knowledge with our members of the Tree Advisory Committee. And if anybody's interested in learning more about that, they may contact me at jennifer.smith3@nashville.gov. Again, that's jennifer.smith3, that's the number 3, @nashville.gov. And I enjoyed talking to you about that. It's a great organization.
Yeah, it is.
Until next time, we will see you.